Tonight, tuba and Wagner horn player Nigel Braithwaite looks back on his life and gives a humorous take on how he's dealt with the catastrophes that have come his way. After being a keen musician for many years, Nigel starts to suspect one day that he might be going deaf, after no longer being able to pick out his own instrument when listening to the radio.
For many years I was a semi-professional horn and Wagner tuba player. My name is Nigel Braithwaite, and this essay is being read out by a professional voice artist. I have a number of impairments arising from mitochondrial disease plus traumatic brain damage. These include mobility problems, a degree of cognitive impairment, heart disease and deafness. By the way, I am using cognitive impairment in place of learning difficulties. As a 61-year-old man, I don't feel that the latter is appropriate. As I write this in my practice room, I look around at the various bits and pieces that remind me of a lifetime surrounded by music. An Abbey Road desk tidy, a repaired French horn bell that is now a plant pot holder, flanked by a 19th century Remy Thibouville piston valve horn on the right, and a Queen on corde de chasse on top of a bookcase stuffed with sheet music. My paternal grandfather was a superb viola player who studied with Benjamin Britten under Frank Bridge in the 1930s. I haven't always been deaf. When I was in my youth, I was hearing, and grew up in a home where music always surrounded me. With very little in the way of gaining actual qualifications when I left school, I became a jobbing horn player. Highlights of those years include Julius Caesar at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, Strauss's Alpine Symphony, Mahler and Bruckner symphonies, not to be forgotten the two performances of Berlioz's Grand Messe des Mots, which calls for vast forces. Playing the horn was a constant for me for 30 years, despite earning my main income as a nurse and clinical product trainer. I never stopped playing and always had a mouthpiece in a pocket to keep my lip in shape. But then, 20 years ago, I was driving up the M1 listening to Rossini's Thievish Magpie Overture on Radio 3. There's a lovely little solo for the first horn in E, close to the beginning. A scale and some arpeggio leaping around. The horn missed the entry and only regained composure for the final tantara. I felt awful for whoever it was. But when I listened to the repeat a few days later through a decent set of headphones, I was taken aback. This time, the horn solo sounded flawless. It dawned on me, and again I felt dreadful. But this time for myself. I couldn't hear my own instrument. Maybe my family were right, and I was going deaf. A hearing test a month or so later confirmed this. Welcome to a life of hearing aids. I find myself putting a hand on speakers or a reverberant surface when I'm listening. I used to be able to identify individual horn players purely from their sound, but now I can hear and feel overtones, harmonics, far more, because they are higher or lower than the notes being played, and in the bit of my hearing where I am less deaf. Still, at the time I was coping well, forging ahead in my career, which now involved a lot of international travel. Due to the onset of diabetes, I negotiated my working week down to 4 days and poured music into every other moment. I became Warwickshire Symphony Orchestra's fourth horn. Musical highlights included Stravinsky's First Rite of Spring on sixth horn, an unexpected solo at the end of part 1, which cuts rhythmically across everything else and basically requires the player to ignore the conductor. I'm good at that. Mahler's Second Symphony, which is just as immense and always brings a lump to my throat. The massive percussion crescendo, the first full choral entry, and the top C in the offstage horn part. Fabulous stuff, and my goodness, how I missed that. And although I was coping then, in reality, I was becoming increasingly deaf and increasingly aware that I wouldn't be able to listen to or participate in music for much longer. Subconsciously, or perhaps consciously, I was making the most of whatever time I had left. In hindsight, I was doing too much, and the consequence of that was not seeing enough of my family. Musically, things were going swimmingly. choral society engagements, symphony orchestra concerts, and occasionally horn quartet playing. But I was also experiencing some very odd symptoms. I was often terrified for no apparent reason, and frequently sensed what I called a chattering demon always on my right side, out of sight. I often felt as if I was falling rapidly and experienced intense feelings of déjà vu. My GP was running tests to see if I had a rare tumour of the adrenal glands. Before the results came, catastrophe number 1 happened. I woke up in the arms of a paramedic. I had an enormous seizure and had bitten through the left side of my tongue. I was extremely confused and disoriented, giving my childhood address and asking for my mum. Once in hospital, I was given a provisional diagnosis of epilepsy and told not to drive for 12 months. This was absolutely devastating for me. Not only was I unable to work, but I also couldn't even drive to rehearsals or gigs. I couldn't even practice my horn with my tongue bitten through, and I wasn't allowed to be left on my own. My fabulous friends and relatives took it in turns to Nigel sit. As I write this, I'm beginning to get a bit agitated. It was an awful time, and remembering it is traumatic. But I'm calming myself down by listening to the Jacques Lussier Trio play Bach. Bach would, I hope, have approved. The MRI scan revealed multiple small brain lesions where rice grain-sized bits of my brain had been starved of blood and died. A chance chat with a medical cousin and a neurologist appointment later, and I was given a new diagnosis: mitochondrial disease. On top of the diabetes, deafness and epilepsy, I now had to come to terms with ischemic brain damage where the blood supply was insufficient. More tests confirmed I had a degree of cognitive impairment affecting my short-term memory and executive function. So, I was medically retired from work. Musically, this was a disastrous time. I was unable to play until my tongue healed, and without a lift in someone's car, I was unable to accept any playing engagements. The level of the catastrophe was starkly highlighted when I eventually got to my first rehearsal months later. I couldn't remember how to transpose. Playing different notes to the ones in front of me, essential for a horn player. I was absolutely bereft. I realised that I couldn't hear anything like as much of what was going on around me musically. My hearing aids were of no help in the orchestral setting. I took a 6-month break from making music. Instead, I became an avid listener. Over time, and with a lot of practice over the next few years, my musical ability did come back. Then, while cycling 5 miles to my daughter's horse, along came catastrophe number 2. This was, for once, nothing at all to do with the mitochondrial disease. Once again, I woke up in the arms of a paramedic. I felt strangely disconnected, and my initial thought was that I'd had another fit. Then I realised I was lying on the road, my clothes had been cut off, including a pair of one-day-old stable boots. I became detachedly aware that my right leg was sticking out at a very strange angle. Someone said something about helicopters. I had come into contact with a large van, and to this day I can't recall the details of the collision. I spent the next 82 nights in hospital, 75 of them attached to my bed by skeletal traction, where a pin through my femur was attached to weights in an attempt to keep my hip fracture in the correct position for healing. It was undoubtedly my friends, music and musicians that got me through that time. Amidst the 19 fractures, one had been missed. My left thumb, absolutely crucial for horn playing. That thumb operates one valve, or in my case 2. It was forced into some semblance of a normal position, ow, 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 and plastered for 8 weeks. A bonus feature of the cast was that it was exactly the right shape to hold a mug or a pint glass. But my hearing continued to deteriorate. I could no longer listen to music without headphones, and there were more gaps. I practiced plenty, but something else was also happening. I was horrified to realise that I could no longer read bass clef without having to work out each note individually. a total disaster for a specialist low notes horn player. I had also lost my ability to read Swedish and German. My next routine neurology appointment changed everything. The hospital had missed my significant brain injury, so I was referred to the absolutely fantastic Brain Injury Specialist Clinic, BISC, at Moor Green in Birmingham. During my 6 months of outpatient rehabilitation, I decided that I wanted to try to make a new working life for myself as a horn player, brass teacher. Boy, did I work hard at my playing, stripping everything away and starting at the beginning again. I managed to get some work teaching beginners at a local secondary school. As a low player in relative demand, I rediscovered my love for the bass Wagner tuba and was even more in demand because I bought one which had been part of the set owned by the German Symphonieorchester des Bayerischen Rundfunks, BRSO. By the end of 2017, I was playing again and things were looking good until catastrophe number 3. Human speech is at a pitch where I have the most hearing loss, meaning that I often need to ask people to repeat themselves. The maximum number of times this can be done is 3, by the way, before the other person says, "It doesn't matter." In rehearsal, a conductor will stop and say things like, "from the upbeat to letter B," etc. Well, when your hearing is impaired, B, C, D, E, P and V all sound the same. At a rehearsal, we were told to go from the letter E. Well, that's what I thought I heard, and so I did. Letter E was a fortissimo, very loud entry for me. Unfortunately, everyone else in the orchestra went from letter D, which was pianissimo, quiet. My sheer embarrassment was made worse by the person at the front yelling, "Oh, for God's sake, I said D." They did apologise as soon as I went to speak to them after, but the harm was already done. And I'm shaking as I write this because this is where my crippling rehearsal anxiety started. While this was an immensely bruising experience, it was also personally galvanising. I began to write about the challenges of being a hard-of-hearing musician on my Facebook page. The post garnered a lot of support, which was cheering, and I came up with a way that conductors can support anyone in their orchestras. The biggest possible help is to make eye contact with the deaf person so that they have the opportunity to lip read like I do. Secondly, please allow time for the deaf person to find the place, particularly if they have to ask another player what you said, and no, they are not talking at the back if that happens. Thirdly, please don't shout at the deaf person for going from the wrong letter. It's humiliating and can create crippling anxieties about rehearsals. It certainly did for me. Being a deaf and disabled musician has taught me a lot. I am far more sensitive to the needs of disabled people, particularly those with invisible disabilities. The MU, Musicians Union, was incredibly supportive of me when I needed it. So, as my ability to listen to and make music dwindled, I became involved with the Equalities Department, ultimately getting elected to the MU's Executive and Equalities Committee and the TUC, Trade Union Congress, Disabled Workers Committee. Deafness has its challenges in the committee environment, but hearing aids do help me. My garden railway and its bonkers imaginary world has been my salvation. Building and filming it have filled the gap where my horn playing used to be. People tell me that I'm an inspiration, although to me it's simply life and getting on with it. At least, I think that's what they say. It may, of course, be something entirely different.